When I left my son alone with the man I thought I could trust, I never imagined I'd return to find the light in his eyes gone. What I uncovered inside our own home shattered everything I believed about love, family, and safety. My name is Nia. I live in a quiet neighborhood near Augusta. I work at a small transport office checking delivery papers and schedules. Life is simple. My son's name is Ethan. He is 8 years old. After the divorce, I raised him alone for almost 3 years. Then I met Daryl. He seemed steady, calm, polite. Worked as a mechanic, didn't talk much, but when he did, it sounded solid. Ethan was careful at first, then got used to him. A year later, we married. At the start, everything looked fine. The house stayed clean, food on the table, my boy went to school, and I thought maybe life was finally balanced. But later, small things began to bother me. Ethan grew quiet. When I came home from work, he stayed in his room. He stopped smiling as much. Sometimes I found him sitting awake at night, eyes open, just staring. When I asked what was wrong, he said he was fine, but his eyes said something else. Daryl told me I was overthinking. He said boys go through phases, that Ethan was growing up and needed firmer discipline. His tone was casual, like he was explaining a repair job. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I didn't. One afternoon, Ethan's teacher called. She said he had become withdrawn, distracted in class, less talkative with other children. That was when I started watching closer. I noticed he flinched when Daryl spoke too loudly. Sometimes, when his stepfather entered the room, Ethan froze, shoulders tight. If Daryl reached out to pat his head, Ethan moved away slightly, pretending not to notice. I asked Daryl if something had happened. He said, "He needs to learn respect. Boys today grow soft." That sentence stayed in my head for days. That night, when Ethan went to bed, I sat beside him. I said he could tell me anything. He shook his head and whispered, "I can't." I asked why, but he only said, "He'll be mad." I didn't push further. If you believe silence should never protect abuse, act now. Like, comment and subscribe. It costs nothing, but it can change everything for someone still afraid to speak. The next day, when Daryl went out fishing with a friend, I checked Ethan's room. Nothing strange, except for the old teddy bear lying under the bed. It was ripped at one arm, stuffing coming out, the fabric damp in places. Ethan had always taken care of his toys. I picked it up and felt something tighten inside my chest. That was the moment I decided to act. I needed to know the truth. The next morning, on my lunch break, I bought a small hidden camera at an electronics store. The clerk showed me how to link it to my phone. I put it on Ethan's bookshelf between some toy cars and books. I checked the image once. Clear. I felt guilty for invading his privacy, but fear overruled guilt. I had to protect him. That night, I pretended to sleep early. Around midnight, I woke up to faint movement. I reached for my phone and opened the app. The screen showed Ethan's room dimly lit by the hallway lamp. The door opened slowly. Daryl stepped inside. I watched him walk to the bed and say something I could not hear. Ethan pulled the blanket to his chin. Then I saw Daryl raise his hand sharply. I stopped the video right there. My body froze. I sat in bed, shaking. It was enough. I did not need to see more. The next morning, I kept everything routine. Breakfast, school, work. Inside, I was burning. When I dropped Ethan off, I told him I loved him and that everything would be all right. He looked confused but nodded. After work, I picked him up and drove to my sister's house. I said we would stay for a few nights because I had repairs being done at home. That evening, after Ethan fell asleep, I opened the recording again. I forced myself to watch the full clip. What I saw confirmed every instinct. My son was terrified, silent, obeying every command from a man who called himself a father. It was not discipline, it was control and fear. The next morning, I went straight to the police station. I explained what was happening and showed the video. The officer's face changed from neutral to serious. He asked if we had somewhere safe to stay. I said yes, with my sister. He told me they would start an investigation and that I should apply for an emergency protective order. I signed every paper they gave me. That night, I deleted nothing. I saved copies of the video on 2 flash drives and 1 cloud folder. I called a lawyer recommended by a coworker and told her everything. She said to stay calm, to let the system do its job, and to keep the child away from the house until further notice. So I did. Ethan stayed with me at my sister's place. I called work and said I needed time off. Daryl called several times, but I didn't answer. I only sent one message: "We are safe. Do not come near us." It was not courage, it was instinct. When something feels wrong with your child, it usually is. I ignored it once. I would not ignore it again. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Ethan was still asleep beside me on the couch at my sister's house. I watched him breathe. His face looked calm for the first time in a long while. When the sun came up, I called my lawyer again. Her name was Carla. She spoke clearly, without emotion, the kind of person who knows what needs to be done. She told me to go to the courthouse as soon as it opened and file for an emergency order of protection. I packed a small bag for Ethan, made breakfast, and left him with my sister. At the courthouse, the clerk handed me a set of forms. The pages asked for details: name of the abuser, relationship, proof, and description of what had happened. I wrote it all down. My hand shook, but I made sure every word was true. Then I handed over the video on a flash drive. Carla met me there and reviewed everything before I submitted it. Within an hour, a judge signed the order. It said Daryl could not come within 100 yards of me or Ethan. The paper looked small, but it felt like a wall between us and danger. By afternoon, the police had already served Daryl with the order. My sister's husband knew one of the officers who confirmed it. He said Daryl had acted surprised, asked a few questions, and then stayed quiet. That silence worried me more than shouting would have. A man like him plans instead of explodes. That evening, Ethan asked when we would go home. I told him we would stay at Aunt Lisa's for a while. He nodded, but I could see confusion in his eyes. He missed his room, his toys, his routine. I sat down with him and said that sometimes adults make mistakes and that we had to stay somewhere safe for now. He asked, "Is it because of Daryl?" I said yes. He looked down and whispered, "I don't want him to find us." I told him he wouldn't, and for the first time, I truly believed it. 2 days later, Carla called again. The county investigator wanted to meet. She explained they needed to verify the living conditions and talk to Ethan gently, with a child specialist present. I agreed. The meeting took place at the social services office. Ethan sat with a woman named Dr. Moore, a psychologist with kind eyes. I watched through the glass while they spoke. Ethan was shy at first, then slowly began to talk. I could not hear what he said, but I saw the tears in his eyes. Dr. Moore wrote notes and later told me he had described discipline at night. She said his account matched the video evidence. That phrase, "matches the evidence," broke me, but it also meant they believed him. After the meeting, we drove back to my sister's house. I made pasta for dinner. Ethan ate quietly, then asked if Daryl would go to jail. I told him that the police were deciding what to do. He nodded again. Before bed, he asked if we could pray. I am not a religious woman, but I said yes. He thanked God for letting us sleep in peace. I could not speak. The next week was slow and heavy. Every sound of a car outside made me look through the curtain. I checked the locks twice before bed. My sister told me to relax, but I could not. The order kept us safe on paper, yet fear stayed in the room like smoke after a fire. Ethan went back to school under a new address note so Daryl could not pick him up. His teacher said he seemed tired but calmer. I started seeing a counselor myself because my hands would not stop shaking whenever the phone rang. Then one evening, Daryl called from a different number. I answered before thinking. His voice was calm, too calm. "You ruined my name," he said. "Everyone's talking. You think that video means anything? You don't know what you started." I hung up immediately and called my lawyer. She told me to save the call log and send it to her. She added it to the file as harassment. I realized he was testing the limits of the order. The following morning, a patrol car stopped by Lisa's house. The officer asked a few questions and reminded me to call 911 if Daryl appeared anywhere near the property. He said they would increase patrols for a few days. That night, I finally slept 6 straight hours. It felt strange to rest without fear. Days passed. I found a small apartment available near my job. The landlord agreed to a short lease. Carla said having a separate address would help my custody case. I spent a weekend cleaning it and making it ready for Ethan. My sister helped me move a few boxes. I bought a used couch, a small table, and a secondhand bed. Nothing fancy, just stable. When Ethan saw his new room, he smiled faintly and said it looked peaceful. That word, peaceful, was enough. One afternoon, as I left work, a coworker said she had seen Daryl's truck parked near the intersection 2 blocks away. My heart jumped. I did not see him myself, but I called the officer assigned to our case. He said they would check. Later, he confirmed the truck had been moved, but they could not prove he had followed me. Still, it showed he was nearby. The officer advised me to vary my routes and keep my phone ready. I followed every instruction. In the next days, small steps brought small relief. Ethan started therapy twice a week with Dr. Moore. I met with a support group for single mothers who had faced domestic violence. Listening to others made me feel less alone. Many of them said the same thing. The hardest part isn't leaving. It's believing you did the right thing. Each story echoed mine in different shapes. One night, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat by the window in our new place. The street was quiet. A dog barked somewhere far away. I thought about everything that had happened in the last few weeks. How a hidden camera, bought with shaking hands, had changed our entire lives. How a child's silence had been a warning I almost ignored. I realized that I no longer felt guilty for recording my own house. I felt grateful, because sometimes protection begins with proof, not words. When I finally lay down to sleep, I whispered to myself, "We are safe tonight." And for the first time, the words felt true. 2 weeks passed since the court signed the protective order. Each morning I walked Ethan to school and waited until he went through the gate. I stayed until I saw him meet his teacher. Only then did I head to work. Life moved slower now, measured by small routines, lunch boxes, homework, and short talks before bed. The fear was still there, but it had edges I could manage. One afternoon, Carla called. Her voice was calm, but I heard tension underneath. She said Daryl had hired a lawyer and filed a motion to revoke the order. He claimed the video was taken out of context, that it showed a father disciplining his stepson. My stomach twisted. Carla told me not to panic. She would file a full response with the police report, the psychologist's notes, and Ethan's statement. She said judges see this pattern all the time, abusers trying to rewrite facts once control slips away. That night, I didn't tell Ethan about the motion. I made him dinner and kept conversation light. He talked about his new friend from class, a boy who liked the same cartoons. When he laughed, the sound surprised me. It had been so long since I heard a real laugh. After he went to bed, I sat on the floor and cried quietly, not from fear this time, but from exhaustion. The next morning, I met Carla at her office. She handed me a printed schedule. The hearing was set for the following week. She said we needed to prepare copies of the video, police statements, and testimony from Dr. Moore. "The truth is on your side," she said. I nodded, though truth alone never felt like enough. During those days, I noticed Ethan changing bit by bit. He slept through most nights. He started drawing again. Houses, trees, cars, always with the two of us standing outside smiling. In one picture, he drew a dark cloud far away. I asked what it was. He said, "That's Daryl. He's gone now." I said, "Yes, and he's never coming back." He smiled and went back to coloring. At work, my manager reduced my hours so I could handle the court case. The paycheck shrank, but it gave me time. In the afternoons, I picked Ethan up and took him to the park. He ran, played, and sometimes just watched other kids. Every so often, he'd hold my hand for no reason. I never pulled away. One evening, a white envelope arrived at my door. It was the formal notice for the hearing. Seeing Daryl's name printed next to mine made my hands shake. I read every word twice, then folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I promised myself that I would not look at it again until the day came. A few nights before the hearing, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching outside. I looked through the curtain and saw headlights pause near the building, then turn away. Maybe a delivery truck? Maybe not. I stayed by the window until the street was dark again. The next morning, I told the officer in charge of our case. He said they would check nearby cameras. I learned to report everything, even when I wasn't sure. The day of the hearing arrived clear and cold. Carla met me at the courthouse entrance. She carried a folder thick with papers. We sat in the waiting area while Daryl and his lawyer talked across the hall. He glanced at me once, expression flat. I looked away. When our names were called, my legs felt heavy but steady. Inside, the judge listened more than she spoke. Carla presented the timeline, my report, the video evidence, the therapist's notes, and the police statement. Daryl's lawyer argued that I had overreacted, that it was a misunderstanding amplified by emotion. When they played the video, the room went silent. The judge stopped it halfway and said she had seen enough. She asked Daryl one question. "Is this your voice?" He said yes. She looked at him for a long second and said, "That will be all." After the session, she confirmed the protective order would remain in effect until further notice. She also granted temporary custody of Ethan to me pending a full evaluation. It wasn't the final step, but it was progress. When we left the courthouse, the air felt lighter. Carla said, "You did well. The system moves slow, but it moves." I thanked her and walked toward the bus stop. My phone buzzed with a message from my sister. "Ethan is fine. He made you a drawing." That evening I came home and found the drawing on the table. It showed a small house with a bright sun above it. Under the roof he wrote 2 words in uneven letters, "Me" and "Mom." Nothing else. I taped it to the refrigerator. It reminded me why every form, every hour in court, every tear mattered. The following week I met again with Dr. Moore. She said Ethan was making progress but still had sudden fears. She recommended steady routines, same bedtime, quiet mornings, predictable plans. Trauma fades through repetition, not words. I followed her advice. Every night we read one story, said goodnight the same way, and left the hallway light on. One evening, Ethan asked, "Will Daryl try to come back?" I said, "No." The judge told him he can't. He asked, "Will he listen?" I looked at him and answered honestly, "If he doesn't, the police will make him." He seemed to accept that. He rolled onto his side and whispered, "I like it better now." I said, "Me too." Life still had cracks, but light was seeping through. A few quiet weeks passed after the court hearing. The house stayed calm. I started to think maybe Daryl had finally accepted what the judge decided. Ethan went to school every morning without looking over his shoulder. I returned to work part-time and kept my phone close just in case. Routine started to rebuild the shape of our lives. Then one Saturday afternoon, as we walked back from the grocery store, Ethan froze. He stared at a black pickup parked across the street. My stomach tightened. The truck looked familiar. I took his hand and kept walking, pretending not to notice. Once we reached the building entrance, I glanced back. The truck was still there, engine running. When we stepped inside, the sound faded, then the engine roared and drove off. I knew that sound. It was Daryl's old truck. Inside the apartment, I locked the door, closed the blinds, and called the officer assigned to our case. He asked for details and told me to stay inside. A patrol would pass by the area. I tried to act normal for Ethan's sake, but my hands shook as I put groceries away. A few minutes later, he asked, "Mom, was that him?" I didn't lie. I said, "Maybe, but we are safe here." He nodded, trusting me completely, and went to draw in his notebook. That night, the patrol car stopped outside. The officer knocked to say they found tire marks that matched Daryl's truck near the street corner camera. He reminded me that the protective order was still valid and that any attempt to approach us counted as a violation. I thanked him and asked if they would contact Daryl directly. He said yes. 2 days later, Carla called. She said the police had issued a formal warning to Daryl and added another note to the case file. "He's testing limits," she said. "Abusers often do that after losing control." I asked if we could move to another address. She said it wasn't required yet, but advised installing basic security cameras at the entrance. I bought 2 small ones the next day and set them up with help from my neighbor. The next week, Ethan brought home a drawing from school showing our building with a tall fence and bright lights around it. He said, "It's a strong house now." I said, "That's right, it's strong." Every small thing he said reminded me that safety is a process, not a switch. At work, my manager let me handle office tasks remotely. That gave me more time to be home when Ethan came back from school. I noticed his posture changing. He no longer flinched at loud noises. He talked more about friends and games. One evening, he even asked to invite a classmate for a play date. It was the first time I heard him plan something ordinary. I said yes, but told the teacher to keep it short and supervised. Seeing 2 boys laughing in the living room felt like air after months underwater. Still, I couldn't relax fully. Fear stayed somewhere behind my ribs. Each ring of the doorbell made me tense. One Thursday evening around sunset, I heard that sound again, gravel under tires. I looked out from the kitchen window. The black truck was parked 2 buildings away. I didn't wait. I called the police, then Carla. Within 10 minutes, a patrol car arrived. They found Daryl standing near the truck, claiming he was visiting a friend. The officer checked his ID and reminded him about the restraining order. Daryl argued, saying he had the right to walk anywhere he wanted. The officer replied that the law gave him the right to walk anywhere except near me or my son. They told him to leave. He did, slowly, with that same blank expression I remembered too well. Later that night, an officer returned with paperwork confirming the violation report. He said this could help strengthen our custody case. Carla called again the next morning to say she was filing a motion to extend the order permanently. "He crossed the line," she said. "Now we'll make sure he can't again." For Ethan, I kept things simple. I told him that the police had spoken to Daryl and that he couldn't come near us anymore. Ethan seemed relieved, but that night he had a nightmare. He woke up crying, saying someone was knocking on the window. I sat beside him until he fell asleep again. After that, I started leaving the hallway light on every night. A week later, we went back to see Dr. Moore. She said Ethan's recovery was progressing, but new incidents could slow it down. She recommended more grounding routines, morning walks, small chores, steady eye contact, honest talk. She also suggested I start therapy myself to manage my own fear. I agreed. We both needed to heal, not just survive. As days passed, calm slowly returned. I tried to rebuild practical things. I bought secondhand furniture for the apartment and repainted Ethan's room a soft green. He helped with a roller brush, laughing when paint splattered his arm. I took a photo of that moment. His smile genuine, no trace of fear. It became my proof that progress existed. One afternoon, Carla called with good news. The judge approved the motion for an extended protective order. It now lasted until the full custody hearing, scheduled for the following spring. "He can't contact you in any form," she said. "Not calls, not messages, nothing." I thanked her, then sat on the couch holding the phone, feeling something I hadn't felt in months, space to breathe. That evening, I told Ethan. He listened quietly, then said, "So he can't come back at all?" I said, "No, he can't." He smiled, small but real, and said, "Then can we get a dog now?" I laughed softly. "We'll think about it." The next morning, I opened the window and let fresh air in. The world outside looked ordinary. Children heading to school, someone mowing a lawn, a dog barking down the street. Ordinary meant safe, and safe was enough. For now, that was everything. The following month brought a kind of quiet rhythm I had almost forgotten. Ethan went to school every morning, came home in the afternoon, and we followed a steady pattern of homework, dinner, reading, and sleep. He began sleeping through most nights. Sometimes he still woke up from dreams, but they were fading. I could finally go an hour without checking the locks or glancing through the blinds. At the end of the week, Carla called about the next step, the full custody hearing. It would decide whether I kept permanent custody or if Daryl could petition for visitation. Just hearing those words made my stomach tighten. I asked if there was any chance he could get access again. She said, "With the video, the violation, and the therapist's report, it's unlikely, but we have to follow every step by the book." So we gathered every piece of evidence again. Copies of the protective orders, the police logs, Dr. Moore's notes, and Ethan's drawing. I started working from home more often. My boss allowed me to handle delivery schedules remotely. The company sent me a small laptop, and I used the kitchen table as a desk. It was simple, but enough to pay bills and keep structure. I wanted Ethan to see stability, not chaos. Dr. Moore met with us twice each week. She said Ethan was beginning to separate memory from present time. That meant he was starting to understand that what happened before could not happen again. During one session, she asked if I wanted to join for a short talk. I agreed. She asked Ethan to tell me what makes him feel safe now. He said, "When Mom is home and when there's light in the hallway." Then he added, "When people talk calm." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. On weekends, we visited my sister's family. Her kids played with Ethan, and for the first time, he looked like a normal child among others, running, laughing, asking for snacks. One afternoon, my sister pulled me aside and said, "You're getting your color back." I realized she was right. I had been living in survival mode so long I had forgotten what normal felt like. Still, small reminders of the past appeared in odd ways. Once I found Ethan's old teddy bear in a moving box, the same one that had been torn. I asked if he wanted to keep it. He shook his head and said quietly, "Throw it away." I did. Some things don't deserve to stay. One evening, Carla called with a new update. Daryl had filed a short statement claiming he wanted a chance to rebuild the relationship with his stepson. She said not to worry. It's common. Judges expect these attempts. They usually backfire because they show no understanding of the damage done. Still, hearing that he was trying again unsettled me. The next day, I added another small security camera near the back entrance. Ethan continued therapy. Dr. Moore introduced small exercises to rebuild confidence. She asked him to write down 3 things he liked about himself. He wrote, "I can draw. I am brave. I am good." When she showed me the paper, I cried quietly. She said, "This is progress." The days before the custody hearing were long. I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying every step, every statement, every form I had signed. Carla told me to stay calm, answer questions directly, and bring no emotion into the courtroom. She said, "Judges trust facts, not tears." The hearing took place on a gray morning. I wore plain clothes and carried only one folder. Daryl arrived with his lawyer. He avoided looking at me, but I could feel the tension in the room. The judge opened by reviewing the prior orders and police reports. Then Dr. Moore testified. She explained Ethan's symptoms, the nightmares, and the gradual recovery after we left the house. She said clearly that contact with Daryl would cause regression. The courtroom was silent. When it was my turn, the judge asked me to describe our current life. I spoke simply. My son goes to school, sleeps well, attends therapy, and lives without fear. I work from home to be with him. We have structure and peace. That was all. Daryl's lawyer tried to question the video again, claiming it lacked sound context. The judge interrupted him. "The child's fear provides all the context needed," she said. She then looked at Daryl and asked if he had completed any counseling or anger management program. He said no. She wrote something down. After closing arguments, the judge said she would issue a written decision within 2 weeks. Carla whispered that it was a good sign. Judges rarely delay unless they want to confirm every detail before finalizing. We walked out of the courthouse into cold air. I felt drained but light. Ethan was waiting with my sister at a cafe nearby. When he saw me, he ran and hugged me. He asked, "Is it done?" I said, "Almost." He smiled and said, "I think we'll win." I said, "We already did." That night, I cooked his favorite food, simple pasta with butter and cheese. We ate quietly, both tired but peaceful. Later, he drew another picture. This time, there was no dark cloud, just blue sky and a green yard. I asked what it was. He said, "Our next day." I pinned it next to the other one on the fridge. When I finally went to bed, I realized I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring anymore. Silence no longer meant danger. It meant rest. 2 weeks later, the letter from the court arrived. The envelope was plain and thin. I held it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was one sheet of paper with the final decision. The judge granted me full and permanent custody of Ethan. She denied all visitation rights to Daryl until further psychological evaluation and proof of rehabilitation. The words looked simple on paper, but they closed an entire chapter of fear. I sat on the couch, reading the lines again. Then I called Carla. She said, "It's over. You did everything right. He has no access, and any contact attempt will be a criminal offense." I thanked her, then set the phone down and just sat there in silence. For the first time in a long while, silence felt like freedom. Ethan came home from school later that afternoon. He dropped his backpack and asked, "Did the letter come?" I nodded and handed it to him. He read the first line, then looked at me. "So we don't have to see him ever again?" I said, "No, we don't." He smiled, that small, shy smile he had before all this began, and hugged me tight. "Can we paint my room now?" he asked. "Any color you want," I told him. That weekend, we went to the store and bought a few cans of light blue paint. Ethan said it looked like sky. We spent the whole Saturday painting, laughing when drops landed on our arms. When it was done, the room looked fresh and new, as if no shadows had ever touched it. He taped one of his drawings to the wall, a picture of a house, a big sun, and a stick figure mother holding her son's hand. Underneath, he wrote, "Safe." The next week was calm. The lawyer handled closing paperwork, and I focused on normal life. I took on more work hours from home, balanced invoices, cooked, cleaned, helped with homework. Nothing dramatic, just steady living. Each small routine was a way of building something solid again. Dr. Moore reduced Ethan's therapy sessions to once a week. She said he was showing stable recovery, though occasional nightmares still appeared. She also suggested that I join a support group for single parents who had experienced domestic violence. I agreed. At the first meeting, I mostly listened. Each person had their version of the same story: warning signs ignored, slow control, fear behind closed doors. It was strange how ordinary these patterns sounded once you recognized them. At the end of the meeting, a woman asked me, "Does it ever really end?" I said, "It changes shape. Fear gets smaller when you fill the space with new things." She nodded. Back at home, life kept moving. Ethan brought home good grades. His teacher said he was talking more in class, helping other students. She used the word protective. I understood why. A child who learns too early what fear feels like tries to keep others from feeling it. One evening, after dinner, Ethan asked about his last name. He said, "Can we change it? I don't want to have the same name as him." I looked at him and saw how serious he was. I said, "Yes, we can." The next day, I asked Carla what to do. She said it was possible through the same court that handled custody. I filled the form and filed it. A few weeks later, Ethan officially carried my name. When the new document arrived, he held it like a medal. "Now I'm us," he said. We also adopted a small dog from a local shelter. Ethan named him Scout. The first night, the dog slept curled at his feet, and for the first time since everything began, Ethan slept without waking once. In the morning, he said, "He keeps the nightmares away." I smiled and said, "Then he's staying forever." Sometimes I still thought about Daryl, not with fear, but with the strange disbelief that I had once trusted him. I tried not to dwell on it. Dr. Moore said it was common to replay the past, trying to understand when exactly things turned wrong. She said healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means not living there anymore. That made sense. I started jogging early in the mornings before Ethan woke up. The quiet streets and cool air helped clear my mind. Each step felt like a reminder that I was in control of my own time again. At home, Ethan would wait by the window with Scout, waving when he saw me return. It became our small ritual. Financially, things were still tight but manageable. My company offered a permanent remote position, and I accepted. It meant less money than before, but full stability. I didn't need more. What I needed was time. Time to be home. Time to rebuild. Time to let my son grow in peace. One afternoon, Carla called with final updates. Daryl had been ordered to attend a mandatory rehabilitation program and community service. He also faced charges for violating the restraining order earlier. She said, "You don't need to appear in court for that. The state will handle it." I asked if there was any chance he might come back. She said, "If he does, he goes straight to jail." That night, I told Ethan in simple words that the law had made it final. Daryl couldn't come near us, not ever. He listened, nodded, and then said, "Good." He went back to drawing. Later, I looked at his sketchbook. He had drawn a road with two figures walking ahead, hand in hand, the dog beside them, and sunlight all around. There was no shadow in the picture. I realized that we were no longer running from the past. We were walking towards something new. Safety didn't look dramatic. It looked like breakfast on a quiet morning, a child's laughter in the next room, a clean wall with no marks of the old life. That night, before turning off the light, I whispered to myself, "We made it." Then I closed my eyes, hearing nothing but the small sound of my son breathing in his new blue room, safe at last. A full season passed after the final court ruling. The first few weeks felt unreal. Every day I woke expecting a knock on the door or a letter demanding another hearing, but none came. The law was quiet, and quiet meant peace. Life started to take on ordinary shapes again. School mornings, packed lunches, Scout barking for breakfast, the smell of coffee, the sound of Ethan's laughter echoing down the hallway. Ethan turned 9 that spring. We didn't have a party, just a small dinner with my sister's family. He asked for a simple chocolate cake, nothing fancy. When he blew out the candles, he said, "This is my new start." Everyone clapped, and I caught myself smiling without forcing it. Later that night, after everyone left, Ethan sat next to me on the couch and said, "Mom, I didn't think we'd ever be happy again." I said, "Happiness isn't gone forever. Sometimes it hides until you find it again." He leaned against me and fell asleep right there. Dr. Moore said birthdays can trigger both joy and anxiety after trauma. She told me to let Ethan set the tone and not push celebrations too hard. He didn't need noise, he needed stability. We kept things calm, just the two of us and Scout. Every week, Ethan brought home drawings from therapy, small victories on paper. One showed a castle with strong walls, another showed a boy holding a flashlight. When I asked about it, he said, "That's me, finding my way in the dark." I pinned that one above his desk. My own therapy sessions continued once a week. I talked less about Daryl now and more about the future, about how to raise a child who knows safety but not fear, strength without hardness. My therapist said healing means replacing fear habits with life habits. I started to notice how my body finally stopped reacting to small sounds. The creak of a door, footsteps in the hallway. None of it made my heart race anymore. Work became stable. The transport company expanded local contracts, and I was promoted to logistics coordinator. It wasn't a big raise, but it came with predictability. I could plan bills, meals, and weekends, simple things that once felt unreachable. I bought a secondhand bike for Ethan so we could ride to the park together. At first he was nervous, afraid of falling. The first few rides were slow, cautious. Then one afternoon he found his balance and rode ahead, shouting, "I'm doing it!" That moment felt like a symbol of everything we had survived. At home, we made new routines. Monday nights were movie nights, always something lighthearted. Wednesday evenings were for drawing or reading together. Saturday mornings, we went to the farmer's market and bought vegetables for the week. The woman at one stall always gave Ethan an apple for free. He said she reminded him of his teacher. These routines built a rhythm, and rhythm built trust. Sometimes small memories of the past surfaced. Once Scout barked loudly in the middle of the night, and Ethan woke up crying, thinking someone was outside. I held him until he calmed down. In the morning, we checked the cameras. Nothing there, just a stray cat. He looked relieved. Then he said, "Mom, it's weird how memories feel real even when they're not happening." I said, "That's how the brain remembers danger. But every time we check and see nothing, the fear gets smaller." At school, Ethan joined an art club. His teacher said he had a natural sense for colors and shapes. He won a small prize for a poster contest about kindness. The drawing showed hands forming a circle around a smaller hand. When I saw it on the school wall, I felt proud and sad at the same time. Proud because he had turned pain into art. Sad because he had known enough pain to understand protection at that age. Dr. Moore said empathy often grows out of survival. She also said Ethan's progress was exceptional. "He's learning that kindness is strength," she told me. "That's a lesson some adults never master." We started visiting a small lake outside town on weekends. It wasn't far, just a 10-minute drive. We'd take Scout, sit by the water, and watch the sunset. Ethan would throw stones and count how many times they skipped. One evening he said, "I don't think about him anymore." I asked, "You mean Daryl?" He nodded. "It's like he's not real now." I told him, "That's how healing feels, turning something heavy into something small." I stopped locking every door twice. I left windows open again. The air moved freely through the apartment, and I realized how long it had been since I let light in without checking who might see it. The house no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a home. One afternoon, I received a letter from Carla. It said the state had closed the case file on our protection order since Daryl had completed his mandatory program and moved out of state. Reading his name didn't stir panic anymore, only distance. I put the letter in a folder with the old documents and locked it away. That part of life was finished. That night, Ethan asked if we could paint the living room. He said, "It still looks like the old place." I laughed because he was right. The beige walls felt heavy. We spent the next weekend painting them bright yellow. The light in the room changed completely. It made everything look new. When we finished, Ethan said, "Now it looks like the sun lives here." I said, "Then it's perfect." As spring ended, I realized how far we had come. The marks on Ethan's spirit were healing, and so were mine. We were no longer just survivors of something. We were people building a normal life again. Normal sounded simple, but it was the hardest thing to reach. Every night before bed, I walked past Ethan's room. He'd be asleep, Scout curled near his feet, the hallway light still on. That small glow reminded me what safety really means, not fear of darkness, but trust in light. I closed my eyes and whispered the same line every night before sleeping. We are safe, and that is enough. By the end of that year, life had settled into a steady rhythm. The crisis felt far behind, but its lessons stayed close. I didn't live in fear anymore, yet I didn't forget what fear looked like. That memory became a kind of warning light that helped me notice when something felt wrong around me or others. Dr. Moore suggested that I speak to a local parent group about our experience. At first, I said no. I didn't want to reopen old wounds. But she said, "You don't have to tell every detail. You just show that rebuilding is possible." After a week of thinking, I agreed. The meeting took place in the basement of a community center. There were about 10 people sitting in folding chairs. Some were parents, some grandparents, a few social workers. I told them I wasn't a speaker, just a mother who once ignored her instincts for too long. I said that silence protects abusers, not children. I explained how small signs, a child's sudden quietness, changes in sleep, or fear of one person, are not random. I described how I placed the camera, filed the report, and followed every legal step. No drama, no embellishment, just facts. When I finished, one woman in the back was crying. She came up later and said, "Your story gave me courage. My daughter has been acting the same way, and I kept telling myself it was a phase." I gave her Carla's contact and told her to document everything before confronting anyone. Walking out of that building, I realized something. Helping others didn't reopen the wound. It closed it properly. Ethan's progress continued. At school, he became a quiet leader, the kind of child others followed because he stayed calm when things got messy. His teacher told me he helped stop a bullying situation by stepping in and saying, "Everyone deserves to feel safe." Hearing that nearly broke me, in a good way. He was turning his pain into protection for others. We added a few new habits at home. Every Sunday, we cooked together. He handled the salad, I did the main dish. Scout always sat near his feet, waiting for a piece of bread to fall. Cooking became our talk time. That was when Ethan told me about school, friends, and his drawings. One night he said, "I think I want to be a counselor when I grow up, like Dr. Moore." I said, "You'd be great at it." He smiled and said, "Because I know how it feels." I still met with Dr. Moore every month. She said Ethan's emotional growth was ahead of schedule. "He's learning empathy instead of bitterness," she said. "That's not common in cases like his. You gave him that model." I didn't feel like I'd done anything special. I just kept showing up. Consistency was the quiet medicine both of us needed. Financial life got better too. The company expanded again, and I was promoted to senior coordinator. It came with a pay raise and benefits. I opened a savings account for Ethan's future. When I told him about it, he asked if we could also donate some to the shelter where we found Scout. I said yes. We drove there the next weekend with dog food and blankets. The staff thanked him, and he said, "It's for the dogs who need to feel safe, too." Sometimes people in town recognized me from the community meetings. They'd stop to say thank you or share short versions of their stories. It was strange being seen that way, but I understood it wasn't about fame. It was about connection. Each story shared made it harder for abuse to stay hidden. One afternoon, Dr. Moore invited both of us to speak at a regional seminar for teachers. The goal was to train them on early warning signs of abuse. Ethan agreed, though he said he didn't want to talk much. During the event, I described how teachers were the first to notice changes in him and how their reports gave credibility to my case. Then Ethan stood up and said one sentence, "If a kid stops smiling, don't think they're just growing up." The room was silent. That single line said more than any lecture. Afterward, several teachers thanked him. One said, "You helped me see my students differently." That night, as we drove home, Ethan looked out the window and said, "I didn't know talking could help people." I said, "That's what truth does. It helps." We started volunteering once a month at the same community center. I handled logistics, and Ethan helped with pet adoption events and art workshops for children. He liked drawing with younger kids, showing them how to blend colors. Sometimes he came home with paint on his hands, smiling. Each stain felt like proof of normal life. Every evening we still kept our rituals. Lights on in the hallway, Scout sleeping near his bed. Goodnight words said the same way. There were no nightmares for many months. One night I asked him if he still remembered Daryl. He said, "Not really. It feels like a story that happened to someone else." That was the moment I knew healing had reached the deeper layers. Still, I kept one rule. Never ignore signs of fear, no matter how small. If Ethan came home quiet, I asked what was wrong. If he avoided eye contact, I waited until he talked. He always did. The trust between us had grown into something solid. As months passed, my therapy sessions shifted toward the future. My counselor asked, "What do you want for yourself, apart from being a mother?" I didn't have an answer right away. For so long, my identity was survival and protection. I said, "I want to learn again, maybe study something." She said, "Then do it." I enrolled in a night course at the local college for business management. It was hard balancing work, classes, and parenting, but it gave me energy. Ethan helped with chores, saying, "I'm your assistant." We studied side by side, he with math homework, me with spreadsheets. Those evenings made me realize how far we had traveled from fear to function. By the time summer came, the apartment looked brighter, both literally and in spirit. The walls shone yellow, Scout snored on the rug, and laughter filled the rooms. Sometimes I stopped and watched my son sketch quietly, light from the window on his face, and thought, This is what recovery looks like: ordinary, steady, and alive. Another year passed quietly. The court papers were stored away, and I almost never looked at them anymore. They sat in a box at the back of the closet, sealed with tape, labeled simply documents. That box felt like a tomb for an old life. I didn't need to open it again. By then, Ethan had started middle school. He was taller, more confident, and more outspoken than I expected. The shy boy who once hid behind me now stood straight and talked easily with teachers. His favorite subject was art, but he also liked science because, as he said, it explains how things work, not just how they look. I noticed that phrase said a lot about who he was becoming, someone who wanted to understand, not just feel. Our dog Scout grew older too, slower, but still loyal. Every morning, Scout followed Ethan to the door and waited until he left for school, then slept by my chair while I worked. My job at the transport company had become stable, predictable, and quiet. I managed shipments, updated schedules, and handled emails. No drama, no chaos. I liked it that way. At night, I continued taking classes at the local college. It was hard balancing study with work, but Ethan encouraged me. "You helped me do homework for years," he said once. "Now it's my turn to help you." On weekends, he quizzed me on business terms while we cooked breakfast. He was good at it, probably better than I was. Dr. Moore suggested that we begin closing our regular therapy sessions. She said Ethan no longer showed signs of trauma. "He has integrated the past," she said. "That means it's part of his story, not his identity." We agreed to keep occasional check-ins every few months. I didn't argue. Letting go of that constant support felt strange, like removing training wheels, but it was time. Around that period, the community center where we had once spoken invited me to coordinate a new awareness program. It aimed to train parents, teachers, and police officers on recognizing early signs of abuse. They said they needed someone with real experience, not just theory. I accepted. The extra work didn't pay much, but it mattered. Every session felt like closing another hidden door where silence used to live. Ethan sometimes joined me at those meetings, sitting quietly in the back, sketching while I talked. After one session, a man approached us and said, "Your story helped me save my niece. We recorded the proof before confronting anyone." I thanked him, but it was Ethan who answered softly, "That's why Mom talks." Hearing that made every late night worth it. The house itself began to reflect our new phase. The yellow walls stayed, but we added small details: shelves for books, plants by the window, a photo of us at the lake. Normal life collected around us like layers of safety. I also started saving to buy a small car. I hadn't driven since Daryl left, partly by choice, partly by fear. One morning, Ethan said, "Mom, you teach others to face fear, but you still take the bus everywhere." He was right. I signed up for a driving refresher course. By the end of the month, I had a license again and a used gray sedan parked outside. The first time I drove Ethan to school, he smiled and said, "Now we can go anywhere." In late autumn, the community center hosted an event honoring volunteers. I received a simple plaque that read, "For service and courage." I didn't make a speech. I just said, "For every story told, there's a child who sleeps safer tonight." It wasn't poetry. It was truth. Back home, Ethan placed the plaque on the shelf next to his art trophies. He said, "It belongs here. Both are about winning something hard." Later that evening, he told me he wanted to write an essay about our story for a school project on resilience. I hesitated. "It's your choice," I said, "but you don't owe anyone the details." He answered, "I just want people to know that bad things don't last forever." When he presented the essay, his teacher called me afterward. She said the class was silent during his talk. He had ended with the line, "Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear tired faces but keep going anyway." I knew he meant me, but I didn't say anything. Life kept unfolding. I finished my night course with good grades and received a small certificate. Carla came to the ceremony. She said, "You're one of the few clients whose story ended the way it should." I smiled and told her that endings are just new beginnings in disguise. As winter arrived, Ethan caught a mild flu. Nothing serious, but it reminded me how fragile peace can feel after long fear. I spent those days making soup, checking his temperature, and watching him rest. He recovered quickly, and when he went back to school, he left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Thank you for everything, Mom. You're my safe place." I folded it and kept it in my wallet. Sometimes at night, after finishing work, I sat on the balcony with tea and looked at the stars. The air was cold and quiet. I thought about how different our lives were from the nights when I hid in silence, listening for footsteps in the hallway. That world felt far away, like a story I once read but no longer lived inside. Ethan was changing fast. His laughter was louder, his confidence stronger. He still had moments of thoughtfulness, but they no longer carried sadness. One evening, he asked, "Do you ever miss him?" I said, "No. I miss the time before everything changed, but not the person." He nodded, understanding more than his age suggested. When I looked at him now, I didn't see a victim. I saw a survivor becoming something more, a person with empathy, purpose, and strength that came quietly, not from anger, but from peace. That night, I turned off the light, checked the lock once, and smiled. The world outside was the same, but inside our home, everything was different. We had built a life steady enough to hold whatever came next. Time moved forward quietly, the way it does when life stops revolving around survival and starts building something real. I no longer counted months since the court case. I counted seasons, how the light changed, how Ethan grew taller, how Scout's fur turned whiter around the muzzle. Ethan entered his early teenage years with a calm that surprised me. He was thoughtful but not withdrawn, curious but grounded. He liked sketching, biking, and helping at the community center. Teachers often told me he had a gift for understanding people. I knew where that came from. Pain, when faced and processed, often turns into perception. My own days filled with work, study, and quiet satisfaction. I kept managing the transport schedules from home, still volunteering on weekends. The awareness program expanded to nearby towns. Sometimes I was invited to speak at schools, and I accepted. I didn't enjoy public attention, but I saw how one honest story could change how adults listen to children. After every talk, a few parents stayed behind to ask, "What did you first notice? What made you sure something was wrong?" My answers were always short. Instinct. Silence from a child isn't peace. It's a message. That simple truth spread farther than I expected. Local news did a small piece about the program, and they used my first name only. I agreed because it might help someone else. I didn't want pity. I wanted awareness. After the story aired, Carla sent me a message that said, "You turned a wound into a warning light for others." I read it twice and left it at that. At home, our lives looked ordinary, and that was the greatest victory. Ethan and I shared dinner every night, Scout asleep near the table, soft music in the background. Sometimes we didn't talk much. Silence had changed meaning. It no longer hid fear. It carried comfort. One afternoon while driving home, I stopped at a red light and glanced to the right. A man crossing the street looked familiar for a second. Broad shoulders, dark jacket. My chest tightened before my mind caught up. It wasn't Daryl, just someone with the same build. The reaction faded quickly, but it reminded me that fear leaves traces in the body long after logic says it's over. That night, in therapy, I told my counselor about it. She said, "That's not relapse, it's residue. It fades each time you face it." The next morning, Ethan asked if he could join a weekend trip organized by his art club. They were visiting a museum in Atlanta. It would be his first time away overnight since everything. I hesitated. My instinct wanted to keep him close, but I also knew trust had to be practiced, not just promised. I said yes. We packed his bag together, checked the contact numbers twice, and the bus left early Saturday morning. That night, the apartment felt too quiet. I kept glancing at the hallway light, still on out of habit. Around 9, Ethan called. He said the museum was amazing and that he was fine. I heard laughter in the background, real teenage noise. After the call ended, I sat on the couch and smiled. Letting him go wasn't fear anymore. It was proof that healing worked. When he came back the next day, he showed me sketches from the trip. Old sculptures, city buildings, people at the station. One drawing caught my eye. A boy sitting alone on a bench with a light shining on him. I asked what it meant. He said, "It's about being alone but not lonely." Dr. Moore saw the same drawing later during a routine session. She said, "He's building identity beyond trauma. That's rare and strong." I said, "He did the hard part himself." She shook her head. "He could do it because you stayed steady. Children borrow stability until they grow their own." At the community center, new volunteers joined the awareness program. Most were mothers who had left difficult homes. I started mentoring them informally, helping with paperwork, explaining how to file protection requests, how to speak calmly to social workers, how to gather evidence without confrontation. I never called it counseling. It was survival knowledge passed forward. One evening, after a session, a young woman approached me outside. She looked exhausted, holding her phone tightly. She said, "I think it's happening in my sister's house, but no one believes me." I gave her Carla's number and the same advice that had once saved us. Document, don't argue. Truth speaks best when recorded. She thanked me and walked away crying. That night I couldn't sleep, but not from fear, because I knew somewhere another family had a chance now. Ethan started asking deeper questions about what happened before, not to relive it, but to understand it. He said, "Why do people hurt the ones they say they love?" I told him the truth. Some people mistake control for care. They think power equals protection. It doesn't. He was quiet for a moment and said, "Then we'll be different." I said, "Yes, we already are." He grew taller that year, his voice deeper. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of the man he would become, a calm presence, firm but kind. He treated Scout with patience, his friends with fairness, and strangers with respect. Once I heard him tell a younger kid, "If you're scared of something, talk about it before it grows." That sentence echoed in my mind. It was the same lesson I had learned too late, now living in him early. That summer, we took a short trip to the coast. It was our first vacation, just 2 days by the sea. The salt air felt like medicine. Ethan collected shells and said, "They look broken, but still beautiful." I thought about how that described us too, cracked, but whole. When we drove back home, he fell asleep in the car, Scout snoring softly in the back seat. The road stretched ahead, long and open, like the rest of our life. I realized that the past no longer chased us. It followed quietly behind, smaller and smaller in the mirror. That night, unpacking, I looked around our apartment. The yellow walls, the framed drawings, the dog curled near the door, and thought, we made something new out of ruin, and it finally feels permanent. The following year came with new challenges, the kind that arrive quietly when everything seems calm. Ethan turned 14 that spring. The day before his birthday, he said, "Mom, can I invite a few friends over?" The question sounded simple, but to me it was a sign of something bigger. He felt safe enough to let people into our home. I said yes, without hesitation. We baked a cake, bought chips, and cleaned the apartment. When his friends arrived, they filled the rooms with noise and laughter. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, listening from a distance. At one point, I heard one of them say, "Your mom's cool." Ethan replied, "She's been through a lot. She's strong." I smiled quietly. Those words meant more than he could imagine. After the party, while cleaning up, Ethan said, "It feels different now, like the house doesn't remember." I knew what he meant. Trauma used to live in the walls. Now the sound of laughter had replaced it. At the community center, the awareness program grew larger. We trained more volunteers and partnered with local schools. I started leading sessions on early prevention, how to spot emotional neglect before it turns physical. I spoke less about my own story now and more about patterns, data, and systems. It felt important to turn experience into structure. Emotion saved one child. Structure could save many. Dr. Moore encouraged me to keep teaching, but she also reminded me to live beyond that mission. Helping others can't replace living your own life, she said. She was right. My identity had become the survivor mother. It was time to remember that I was also just a person. I started doing small things for myself again. I took a photography class on weekends. I went out for coffee alone. I let silence be silence, not a signal of danger, but of space. Ethan noticed and said, "You look happier lately." I told him, "I'm learning how to be more than what happened to us." He nodded and said, "Me too." Around that time, an unexpected letter arrived. It was from the Department of Corrections. It said Daryl had completed his rehabilitation program and petitioned for limited correspondence rights, letters reviewed by a counselor. I read the paper twice. The idea of him writing to Ethan made my hands cold, but I knew what to do. I called Carla. She said the court wouldn't allow contact without Ethan's consent. "He's old enough to have a say now," she explained. "You can talk to him about it, but don't pressure him." That evening, I told Ethan about the letter. He listened quietly and said, "I don't want it. I don't need anything from him." I said, "Then that's final." We signed a statement declining all contact. The paper felt heavy in my hands, not from fear, but from closure. Life returned to normal quickly. We didn't speak of Daryl again. It was just one more door closed for good. Ethan began volunteering at the animal shelter where we had adopted Scout. He cleaned cages, fed the dogs, and helped with adoptions. The staff said he had a calming presence, even with scared animals. One of them told me, "He makes them trust again." I smiled and thought, that's what he's been practicing his whole life. At school, he joined an art competition. The theme was strength. His piece showed a cracked wall with light shining through the cracks. It won first place. When the principal handed him the certificate, he said, "This reminds us that strength isn't about being unbroken." I watched from the back row and realized how much of himself he had poured into that image. That summer, we visited my sister's family in Savannah. She told me she was proud of how we'd rebuilt everything. "You used to talk about survival. Now you talk about living," she said. I hadn't noticed the change until then. One afternoon by the beach, Ethan asked about my past before him. He said, "Did you always know you'd be strong?" I said, "No one knows they're strong until they have no other choice." He nodded, staring at the horizon. Then he said something that stayed with me. "I think strength is quiet. It's when you don't quit, even if nobody sees." That night, we sat on the sand, watching the waves roll in. Scout ran near the shore, chasing shadows. I thought about how small our world had once felt, trapped inside four walls and fear, and how wide it had become again. When we returned home, I found an email from a university researcher asking if I'd participate in a study about long-term recovery from domestic abuse. At first I hesitated. Reliving details wasn't easy, but the study wasn't about pain. It was about resilience. I agreed. They interviewed both me and Ethan. He answered with honesty and calm. When they asked what helped him heal the most, he said, "My mom believed me." Afterward, the researcher told me, "That's the sentence we wish every child could say." Ethan began to think about his future. College, maybe psychology or art therapy. He said he wanted to help other kids tell their stories. I told him that was a good goal, as long as he remembered to live his own life too. He smiled and said, "You'll remind me if I forget." By late autumn, I realized how far I'd come. I no longer flinched at sudden sounds. I didn't check the locks twice. The camera by the door still worked, but I rarely looked at it. It wasn't fear anymore. It was habit. One evening, I printed 2 photos, one of Ethan and Scout at the lake, and one of us in front of our yellow wall. I framed them side by side and hung them above the couch. The space between them felt like time itself, everything we lost, everything we rebuilt. When I turned off the lights that night, Ethan called from his room, "Mom, don't forget the hallway light." I smiled. "Never," I said. The light stayed on. Not as a shield anymore, but as a memory of how we found our way out of the dark. Years passed. Seasons turned over quietly, and the old fears finally dissolved into distant memory. The yellow walls faded a little from sunlight. Scout's steps slowed, and Ethan grew into a young man. He was taller than me now, his voice steady, his smile calm. There was still softness in his eyes, but also something new, peace that had been earned, not given. He finished high school with honors and chose to study psychology at a local university. When he told me his decision, he said, "I want to help people who feel like they can't speak." I nodded, proud and a little scared. Letting him go meant trusting the world again, but I knew he was ready. Before he moved into his dorm, we stood in the hallway of our apartment surrounded by boxes, the same hallway that once glowed with a single light through the darkest nights. He touched the switch and said, "You can turn it off now." I hesitated, then smiled and flicked it off. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full of air. After he left for university, the apartment felt enormous. I kept busy with work, still managing logistics, still volunteering at the community center, now as part of their advisory board. They often invited me to speak at regional conferences. I learned to stand behind a microphone without shaking. The first time I saw a crowd listen to my story without pity, only focus, I realized it had turned into something bigger than us, an instruction, a reminder that vigilance saves lives. One evening, after a talk, a woman came up to me with tears in her eyes. She said, "I grew up like your son. I never told anyone until now. Hearing you tonight made me believe it's not too late to start healing." She hugged me. I went home and sat by the window for a long time. I wasn't thinking of pain anymore. I was thinking of all the people still trapped in silence and how a single story could become a key. Ethan came home on weekends, his hair longer, his face older, but his manner the same. He talked about his classes, his professors, his friends. One night, he told me he had joined a student group that offered peer counseling to younger students. "Sometimes they just need someone to listen," he said. "You'd be proud." I told him I already was. Dr. Moore retired that year, but she sent a letter wishing us both well. She wrote, "Healing isn't a moment. It's a life built in layers. You've built yours well." I kept that letter on the refrigerator door. Scout passed away quietly one morning, already old and tired. Ethan was home that weekend. We buried him near the lake where we used to go when Ethan was small. Ethan placed one of his childhood drawings, a simple sun, inside the box before we covered it. We stood in silence for a while. Then he said, "He watched over us when we needed it." I said, "He did." Loss felt gentle this time, not violent. It was part of living, not surviving. The years that followed moved evenly. I took more time for myself. I traveled a little, just short trips, places I once feared to go alone. I learned to take photos again, real ones this time, not through windows or security lenses. The camera that once captured proof now captured peace. Ethan finished his degree and got accepted into a master's program in counseling. When he graduated, he invited me to the ceremony. The auditorium was full, and when his name was called, I stood up before realizing it. He looked into the crowd, found me, and smiled. After the ceremony, he handed me his cap and said, "For all the nights you stayed awake." Later that year, he got a job at a youth center not far from town. He worked with kids who had lived through domestic violence. He never told them his full story. He just listened. Once he said, "I don't need to tell them everything. They feel it. They know I understand." One evening, he came over for dinner, bringing a small plant for the kitchen window. He said it was to replace the old one that had dried out. We ate together, talked about simple things, and laughed. At one point, he said, "You know, Mom, you never gave up on me. That's why I never gave up on myself." I couldn't answer right away. I just reached out and held his hand. After he left that night, I sat alone at the table, the small plant between us like a new symbol of everything we'd built. Life wasn't loud anymore. It was steady, kind, and real. The next morning, I woke early and took a walk to the park. The air smelled of rain and children were playing nearby. I saw a mother calling softly to her son, her voice full of patience. It made me think of how far I had come from the woman who once whispered in fear through locked doors. At the community center, I kept mentoring. More people came, some young, some old, each with their version of the same story. I no longer carried mine as a wound, but as a tool. I told them, proof saves, patience heals, and time rebuilds. Simple, true words. When I returned home that evening, sunlight filled the apartment. I looked at the 2 framed photos on the wall, Ethan as a child with Scout, and the 2 of us by the lake years later. Between them was another frame now, one with a quote Ethan had written in college. "We heal not when the pain ends, but when we stop fearing it will return." I read that line every day. It reminded me that the story didn't end with rescue or revenge. It ended with peace earned slowly, through ordinary days and consistent love. Sometimes new families contacted me after seeing our interviews or hearing me speak. They asked, "Does it ever truly go away?" I told them, "Not completely, but it stops controlling your life. That's enough." Now, when I walk through the door at night, the first thing I notice isn't silence or threat. It's warmth. The same hallway light still hangs there, but I rarely turn it on. We don't need it anymore. The dark isn't something to fear now. It's just another part of the house. Ethan visits often. He still draws, though now his work hangs in local galleries. One of his newest pieces is called The Light Between Rooms. It shows 2 doors slightly open, with a soft glow spilling through. When I asked what it meant, he said, "It's about home, about how even in the darkest places, the smallest light is enough." And that's how our story closes, not with noise, but with calm. A mother who chose to see, a child who learned to trust again, and a life rebuilt one quiet day at a time. Every night before I sleep, I whisper the same words that carried us from fear to freedom. We are safe. We are home. If you believe every family deserves safety, like and share this story. Subscribe so more voices can find their way home.